inflation is a very simple concept. It's just the money supply expanding. And so the more money there is, right, that's what you're inflating. That's where the word literally comes from. Over time, the government has been very successful in changing the definition of inflation to fool the public as to its source. Because if the public understood what inflation was, they would know that it's not caused by grocery stores. You know, when Kamala Harris says it's greedy grocery stores that are causing inflation, if you understand that inflation is an increase in the money supply, well, you know it can't possibly be the grocery stores because they don't have a printing press. They can't expand the money supply. But if you think that inflation is rising prices, well, yeah, the grocery store keeps raising my prices, so they're causing inflation. They're raising prices because the government created inflation. The prices are going up in response to the inflation that's been created. But by changing the definition of inflation, the government not only confuses the public as to who's creating it, but now they're able to blame it on other factors like greedy corporations or Putin. That was, Biden kept talking about Putin, and Putin was causing the inflation. There's only one source of inflation in America, and that's the Federal Reserve. But the reason the Federal Reserve is creating all that inflation is because the government is running massive deficits. And so the Federal Reserve is financing those deficits by buying those bonds with the inflation that it creates, the money that it prints. And so the best way to look at inflation is a tax, right? Inflation is what we pay for the government that we don't pay for with the income tax or the Social Security tax or a sales tax. Basically, the deficits, the federal budget deficits, we end up funding them by inflation. And those deficits are about to skyrocket. They've been skyrocketing. And so the inflation tax is going to be much bigger in 2025 than it was this year, regardless of what the Fed is trying to tell us.
How do we look at the Fed signaling that they're going to bring rates down, which we know they do because inflation has come under control? That's the public messaging. How do we reconcile that they're messaging that with you saying, no, this is them giving up, this is capitulation, and what you're looking at is not what they're saying? How do we reconcile those two views?
Well, the Fed is now focused on employment, the economy, which has clearly come under a lot of pressure recently, is very close to officially, I think, falling into recession. I think we've been in recession pretty much the whole time. I just don't even believe the numbers the way the government manufactures them. So I don't think we've ever had a strong economy. I just think that that's just been a statistical, anomaly. And even if you look through the statistics, you can actually see a lot of the inherent weakness that is being masked by a lot of these superficial numbers. But when the Fed stopped hiking rates, it was because banks started to fail. If you remember what happened with Signature Valley Bank or Signature Bank, Silicon Valley Bank, a few banks started to fail as a result of rising interest rates. And then the Fed really backed off. And of course, they had to have a big bailout program to prevent a lot more banks from suffering a similar fate. But that's really when the rate hikes stopped. And so the Fed kind of kept rates where they were, but kept implying that, look, we're going to cut eventually. We just need enough proof that inflation is going back down to 2%. And they said, we're not going to wait for 2%. We just have to believe that it's going there. Now, of course, the reason they're not going to wait for 2% is because it's never going to get to 2%. And they probably know that. But at this point, the jobs numbers are getting so bad, right? The non-farm payroll report that we had, the most recent one was horrible. And now the government fessed up and came back and said, 818,000 jobs that we claimed were created. Oh, we made a mistake. They're not actually there. And I think they made a bigger mistake. I think there's actually a lot more jobs that they're pretending were created that aren't really there. And in fact, the only reason that we have more jobs now than when Biden was elected is because so many people have 2 or 3 jobs. That's where all the jobs are coming from. It's moonlighting. And the people that now have 2 or 3 jobs, they don't want all these jobs. They'd like to be able to support their family on one job But unfortunately, the rent's gone up so much, the grocery bill, the utility bill, the insurance, everything is now so expensive because of all this inflation that people have to work multiple jobs. And now Joe Biden wants to claim credit for creating those jobs, but the public blames him for the fact that people are forced to work those jobs. But I think it's the weakness in the economy that is prompting the Fed to cut rates, which they're going to do here in September. They've now prepared the markets for these cuts, and they're not going to just do one and done. This is going to be the beginning of as many rate cuts as they can get away with. And I think ultimately they're going to return to QE. They've already reduced the size of their quantitative tightening program. And I think that was the first step to reversing it and going back to QE, which is inflation creation. QE is just, another word for inflation. Just that, it sounds better. It's like it's a euphemism, but that's really what it is. But the Fed has to pretend that it's finished the job on inflation. It can't, be honest and say, look, we still have high inflation and it's going to go up, but, we don't care. So they have to pretend that the 3% inflation that we have now is going to go down to 2%. But, we've been at 3% now for over a year, right? We went down from 9 to about 3, but there's no indication that we're going from 3 to 2. In fact, if you look at the market indicators on Friday, when Powell, delivered his statements, his Jackson Hole speech, on that day, gold was at a new record high. The gold price was above 2,500. I mean, as we're speaking here, I think it's around 2,520. And the US dollar index on Friday sank to a 13-month low. So when you see a weak dollar and when you see surging gold prices, that's an indication that monetary policy is too easy and that inflation is going up, not down. In fact, the only reason that inflation came from 9% year over year to 3% was because we got a 24% rise in the value of the dollar. That happened. And after that big rise in the value of the dollar, then prices started to come down because the dollar was so much more valuable relative to other currencies. That brought down commodity prices and that brought down the CPI. But now the dollar has already fallen 10% from its peak, and it looks like it's going to fall a lot more. This weak dollar is going to be a huge tailwind for inflation, and record high gold prices are telling you that that's exactly what's going to happen.
Yeah, this is the part that I want people to understand, is that if you are trying to track inflation yourself, if you're trying to understand how prices are going up, there is a lot of manipulation that's happening behind the scenes to control the public's perception of the CPI number, including that a rise or lower in the value of the dollar is going to have an impact on CPI. How they calculate CPI, excuse me, which has changed over time, that's also going to impact things. And what I want people to understand, and please correct me if you think that I'm delusional about this, is that the government is doing sleight of hand. They're manipulating the numbers, they're doing sleight of hand so that they can basically, I'll be aggressive here and use the word steal money from the people, not have to get people to vote so that they can keep doing just absolutely outrageous amounts of spending, because they can get your dollars from you without having to ask for them by simply driving pricing power down, or purchasing power, excuse me, through inflation by printing the money. Now,
yeah, well, the way politicians get elected is they promise the voters something for nothing. That's what people vote for. It's like, what are you going to give me? If I vote for you, what's in it for me? What do I get? Right? It's not like people are saying, leave me alone. I just want to be free. People want free stuff. It's if you're in office, what are you going to give me that I don't now have? Right? Because that's what people are voting for. They're voting for stuff, free stuff. And so that's, inherently the problem with democracy. And that's a whole different podcast. I mean, that's, we should be a republic and not a democracy. This is the inherent flaw in that type of system. And we're just demonstrating it all over again. Not like we need to. History is littered with examples of failed democracies for the same reason that we're failing now. But the politicians want to get elected, and so they want to give voters something for nothing. Well, how do they do that? Well, they create inflation, right? They give voters stuff that they don't make them pay for through taxes. See, if the government said, okay, we're going to give you health care or education, and here's the bill, right? We're going to raise your taxes so that you can get this benefit. The people would like, well, I forget, I don't want that. I don't want my taxes to go up. But when they say, look, we're going to give you this stuff and your taxes aren't going to go up, right? You're getting it for free, then that sounds great. Or we'll just tax the rich to pay for it. Well, the problem is they can't get enough money from the rich to pay for all these promises. So where do they get the money? Well, they just create it. So that's inflation. And so instead of taking your money, they just take your purchasing power. And so now everything you want to buy is more expensive. And the difference between what prices would have been without all those government programs and how much higher they are as a result of those programs, that's your tax, right? But the people don't know that they're paying a tax. They just think they're paying prices, and they blame the business. And the government, it's great for the government because now the government can say, you see, capitalism is bad. See, these greedy businessmen are gouging you by jacking up your prices. When they're not, they're simply passing on the higher costs that they themselves have to pay to stay in business. And those costs are going up because of the inflation that the government is creating. But, the government obviously, too, since they create inflation, they want to lie about how bad it is. They don't want to acknowledge it. So the way it's measured doesn't come close to capturing the true increase in the cost of living. They've changed the methodology for the CPI over the years to make the number smaller or littler. They did the same thing with unemployment. Unemployment is only low because we changed how we measure it. There are lots of people today who are unemployed who we don't count. But if you go back in the past, those people that we don't count today used to be counted. and so the main reason that unemployment is low now is because so many people that we used to count as unemployed in the past, we don't count them anymore. In fact, we have a lot of those people now that, if we still counted unemployment the way we counted it before 1994, we'd have unemployment above 10% right now. So there's no way anybody would be able to claim we've got low unemployment if it was 10%. So you take 3/4 of the unemployed and you don't count them anymore. And it's only 4%. And now Biden gets to brag about how low the unemployment is. Meanwhile, we've got a lot of people who are unemployed who are not in the statistics. And the same thing with inflation. Inflation is a lot higher than the CPI reveals. And so even if we can get inflation down to 2%, it wouldn't be 2%, it'd be 4 or 5%. And right now, they're saying it's 3% because it's probably 6%. So it's not even close to the 2% target that the Fed claims it has.
Yeah, which is uber devastating to people's wealth creation in ways that they don't fully understand. And this is why the sleight of hand works, is because people don't understand how it's actually playing out. Let me ask you, why can't we just raise rates and solve the problem of inflation?
Well, first of all, in order to really solve the inflation problem, it's going to take a much bigger increase in rates than what the Fed has delivered. But the problem is we have so much debt that that's impossible. Go back to Paul Volcker in the 1980. I mean, we have a bigger inflation problem now than we had in the 70s. And to bring that inflation to an end required 20% interest rates.
Whoa.
Now, what would happen if interest rates went to 20% now? I mean, we got up to 5%, right? Imagine if they got up to 20%. Well, we've got a $35 trillion national debt that's financed with treasury bills. Even if we had to finance that at 10%, that's $3.5 trillion a year in interest on the debt. The U.S. government only collects about $4 trillion a year in taxes in total. So we have so much debt. Imagine what would happen to all these corporate bonds if their debt, matured and they had to refinance it at 20% or, anywhere close to that. Or home mortgages that got up, 10% or 12% or 14%, something like that. I mean, we now have so much debt that if you tried to raise interest rates high enough to get rid of inflation, everything would collapse, which is why they're not going to do it. We are stuck with inflation because the alternative is a political non-starter. Because if the Fed actually got rid of inflation, you would have a financial crisis that would make 2008 look like a Sunday school picnic. And
Peter,
you would, yeah.
Really, really fast. I just want to say something, and then you can pick that back up, because we use words like inflation, and I think that people get lost. What you're saying is our debt is so high. The only option the government has is to take your money via inflation. But once people understand that, yes, you still have, if you have $100 in your bank account, it's still $100. I understand that, but it buys $90 worth of goods and $80 worth of goods, 70, so on and so forth. And so when you say that the only option the government has, I want to make sure people hear the only option the government has is to take your money. Because once you're like, whoa, wait a second, that's not what I want, then people start thinking in the right way. All right, cool. Now that the audience has that in their minds.
That point. But the point is that they can't raise interest rates high enough to fight inflation without creating a financial crisis. And so that's why they didn't do it. That's why they stopped at 5.25. Because the only way that interest rates slow down inflation is by slowing down debt. They have to get people to borrow less and save more. But even though the Fed raised interest rates, nobody borrowed less. The deficit spending at the federal level went up. Household debt went up. Credit card debt hit all-time record highs. So the Fed never actually got to restrictive monetary policy. They never got to a situation where interest rates were so high that governments and individuals stopped borrowing and started saving. But also, if interest rates got to that level, nobody could afford it. We'd have a complete economic implosion, and the government would have to default on its promises, including its treasury bonds, but it would have to tell people on Social Security that they're not going to get the money that they were promised. And so none of this is politically viable. So what the politicians are choosing is just to have endless inflation. And that takes them off the hook because they don't have to cut Social Security. They just give you the Social Security benefits, and you just can't buy very much because everything costs money. Right? They don't default on the bonds. They pay everybody with money they print. So instead of honestly telling people, we don't have the money to pay you, and so we're going to have to pay you less than we promised, they pay everybody off, but the net effect is you get less because the money buys less. So you lose through inflation instead of through an honest default. But that is always the path that the politicians want to go down because they never have to accept responsibility for creating the inflation. They're always going to blame it on somebody else. And that's why I know that price controls are coming. I mean, I talked about this long before Kamala Harris proposed it, that we were going to get price controls because ultimately that's all the government's got is to blame the businesses and to pass laws to stop people from raising prices. But that never stops the inflation. It just causes the inflation to go underground into the black market because legally you can't buy anything because the prices are too low. And so there's a shortage of everything that you need. And in order to buy the things that you need, you have to go and buy it from a criminal because they're the only ones who will sell it to you. But now you got to pay through the nose because, the guy who's selling you illegal food risks going to jail.
If you want to indulge in a glass or two of alcohol, but don't want to feel crappy the next day, you should try Z-Biotics. Z-Biotics, the pre-alcohol probiotic drink, is the world's first genetically engineered probiotic. It was invented by PhD scientists to tackle rough mornings after drinking. When you drink, alcohol gets converted into a toxic byproduct in the gut. It's this byproduct, not dehydration, that's to blame for your rough next day. Just remember to make Z-Biotics your first drink of the night. Drink responsibly as always. ways, and you will feel your best the next day. Go to zbiotics.com/impact to get 15% off your first order when you use impact at checkout. ZBiotics is backed with 100% money-back guarantee, so if you're unsatisfied for any reason, they'll refund your money, no questions asked. Remember, just head to zbiotics.com/impact and use the code IMPACT at checkout for 15% off. Thank you to ZBiotics for sponsoring this episode and all of our good times.
If you're a small business owner, there is a hidden cost to success: your time. Every hour spent managing finances is an hour not spent growing your business. But that ends today with Found. Found is business banking designed for small business owners just like you. Found consolidates your entire financial ecosystem into one streamlined platform. Banking, expense tracking, invoicing, and tax planning all in one place. No hidden fees, no minimum balances, just pure efficiency. Over 500,000 small business owners have already reclaimed their time with Found. Sign up for Found for free today at found.com/impact. Found is a financial technology company, not a bank. Banking services are provided by Piermont Bank, member FDIC. Found's core features are free. They also offer an optional paid product, Found Plus. Yeah, this all gets crazy really fast. Let me ask you a super pointed question. Do people want to be lied to?
Well, maybe it's like the Matrix. I mean, people can't handle the truth, or that was the Jack Nicholson.
A Few Good Men.
A Few Good Men. They can't handle it. But look, nobody wants to tell the truth to the voters because, again, shoot the messenger. The truth is not pretty. The truth is the government has overpromised. The government has made too many promises that the taxpayers can't keep. And so we need to come clean and be honest. And we have to tell our creditors, we borrowed too much money, we can't pay you back. We got to tell people on government pensions, on Social Security, on Medicare, we don't have the money. We can't give you what we promised. But no politician wants to fess up because the minute you do that, you're not getting the votes. And so everybody wants to pretend that nothing's going to get cut. And so everything gets cut through inflation. But, they have to try to say, well, they're going to fix it. But, even Donald Trump doesn't want to cut Social Security. In fact, he wants to increase Social Security benefits because he wants to eliminate the tax on Social Security, which is like effectively raising Social Security benefits. So, he hasn't identified anything that he's going to cut or eliminate. He talks about waste and abuse, but everybody talks about that. But nobody wants to cut anything. Donald Trump talks about increasing the defense budget. Well, where's that money going to come from? Right? So both candidates want more government, and so they're going to end up with more inflation, regardless of what they're promising. And of course, Donald Trump is partially responsible for the inflation under Biden because a lot of the money that is being used to bid up prices now was printed when Trump was president because Trump ran enormous deficits. Biden is just running even bigger deficits than Trump. Trump set the record for the most amount of deficit spending by a president in a single term, and Biden is going to break that record by the time his term is over. And before that, Barack Obama, he set the record for the most debt under any president, but that's because he had 8 years. But now presidents are doing in 4 years what it took Obama 8 years to do. But this thing is just spiraling. That's why we've got all this inflation. It's not a coincidence. It's cause and effect. And when the Biden administration tries to say, well, you can't blame us for inflation because they've got inflation in Europe. Well, because they made the same mistakes in Europe. They did the same thing. They printed a bunch of euros. They had their own QE program. They called it their asset purchase program. They kept interest rates at zero. In fact, they even had interest rates negative. So all these central banks were operating from the same flawed playbook. They all created massive inflation in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, and then up the ante with COVID. And now the whole world is reaping the whirlwind as all those inflation chickens come home to roost.
Does inflation matter if every government in the world is doing it?
Of course it matters. I mean, on a relative basis, that's what's keeping, the dollar from collapsing against the euro or against the yen or against the pound, because all central banks are inflating. But that doesn't mean we're off the hook. That means we're all suffering together, right? Everybody is experiencing rising prices, even if the exchange rates don't fluctuate very much, because they're all sinking at the same rate. But it means everybody is getting poorer. You need more dollars, you need more euros, you need more pounds to buy, a basket of goods.
All right. So Raoul Paul, when we did the debate between you and him, said that inflation was preferable to default because it happens more slowly. And that was what I had in the back of my mind when I said, do people want to be lied to? It seems like there might be some truth to, yes, dear government, please lie to me. Take my money slowly. Don't tell me you're doing it, so that this plays out over a long enough time frame that sort of everybody gets used to all the money that they've lost. Do you agree that that's a better strategy, or do you think that in reality, default is a better strategy?
Well, the best strategy is not to get into that predicament in the first place. And that's, one of the reasons to be on a gold standard, so governments can't run up that kind of debt. But if the idea is, well, we'll just inflate the debt away slowly, the problem is that, it speeds up. It's like, well, we'll just get a little bit pregnant. It doesn't work that way. It's, it starts off slow until it's fast, right? Once you start going down that road, it's ultimately gonna be a disaster. But I always think at any point, being honest and having a legitimate restructuring of debt is better than constantly creating inflation to try to repudiate it, in secret, right? Just to try to let's, because every time the government creates inflation, they wipe out a good chunk of the debt. We have 35 trillion in debt. If they create 10% inflation, that eliminates 3.5 trillion of the debt. But the problem is, by the time they do that, the actual size of the national debt has gone up by more than the 3.5 trillion because of how much debt we're adding to it every year. And eventually, the higher inflation causes an increase in interest rates. And that is the problem, because all that debt has to be refinanced constantly, because most of the debt is short term. It's not like the government borrowed money for 30 years or 50 years. They borrowed money for 30 days, 90 days, a year. And so they have to constantly refinance it. And as rates go up, because inflation pushes rates up, even though you're wiping out some of your debt through inflation, you're accumulating so much more because the government is borrowing the money to pay the interest on the debt. But I just think that an honest default is preferable. And at least with a default, who loses money in a default? Well, if the government defaults on the bonds, the losers are the people who own the bonds. And a lot of U.S. government bonds are owned by, very wealthy individuals who are clipping coupons and have money invested in treasuries. The average American doesn't own any treasuries, but wealthier people do. And so they're going to lose. They're not going to get back 100 cents on the dollar. But if we just decide to create inflation so that the people who own treasury bonds don't lose anything, well, then everybody suffers. Yes, the people who own treasury bonds, they still lose something because inflation is reducing the value of the principal that they get eventually, and it's reducing the value of their coupon. But now you hit everybody. Now you hit the poor, you hit the middle class, you hit people that don't own any treasuries, that never loaned any money to the government. And what's fair about that? I mean, the people who should take the losses are the people who made the loans to a government that was too broke to pay them back, right? That's the people. And, as far as government commitments, yes, if the government has to cut Social Security benefits, okay, yes, people that were going to get those benefits are going to lose those benefits or have less benefits. But, that's necessarily better, because there are a lot of wealthy people that get Social Security. I mean, I qualify for Social Security. I mean, I'm 61. I'm not taking it yet, but I think I'd be able to start getting it in a couple of years. But it's better for me to lose a lot of my Social Security than some young kid who's struggling to get by has to pay higher inflation so I could get my Social Security benefits. So the government should have a way of reducing Social Security benefits so that the people who are going to get the benefits, they get the loss, as opposed to just spreading the loss on everybody.
Well, there is a way to reduce entitlements without needing to vote for it, and that's CPI manipulation, which is almost certainly happening. So, okay, you're making a what I'll call values-based argument. There may be a moral argument in there as well, but for me to know if this is just values, just the way you see the world, or if you have a objective moral standard, what is your North Star when you lay out your argument?
Well, I think that is the moral way to go.
But anchored by what? Human flourishing, least number of people get wrecked. Like what is the metric by which you say that's a moral argument to do default?
Well, it's the honest way to do it, right? The government can't meet
so
its
be
obligations.
Honest at all times, no matter what that means. We're going to be honest.
Well, it's honest, and the people that took the risk bear the consequences of that risk. People who loan money are the ones that don't get fully repaid, right? The people that lent out the money. But they're going to lose. I mean, if there's inflation, they still lose, right? It's not like they're getting out scot-free. But inflation just spreads the losses among a broader population. But in many cases, it hits hardest the people that could least afford it. So why do we want to create inflation if it's going to create a real hardship for a lot of poor or middle-class people, just so we can avoid wealthy people taking a bigger hit? I mean,
I'm just trying to map. Totally understand. I'm trying to map how you think through this argument. So because when I look at it, the way I would think through this is, for me, the moral way to look at life is what leads to the largest amount of human flourishing for the largest amount of people. I can define human flourishing, but for now, let's just all assume that it's roughly well-being. And if you look at this from a well-being perspective, I have a hypothesis that if you were to default, that you would have an uprising, that there would be literal bloodshed, that there would be a real problem. It would be way more violent, way more abrupt, whereas doing it the way they're doing it now, which I hate, and I think the government has a moral obligation not to do this, but when you compare the two things, I have a feeling that slow and steady theft from everybody actually ends up with a people don't revolt as much, they like being lied to. It just works. And so it's why I think the government does it this way. And I still think it's horrendous.
Well, until it gets out of hand, because it only works for so long.
Well, then let me ask a question really fast so that you can be very pointed with this. Do you believe that is there a conceivable way for productivity to rise so much that we can eventually pay for the debt before inflation eats us alive? Or is this a runaway feedback loop and there is no conceivable way for anything to happen other than collapse at the end of this?
Well, it's more likely the latter. I mean, it's more likely that it's going to run out of control just because of the nature of what we're dealing with, just the size of the debt, the exponential growth, and what happens to interest on the debt. See, the problem with this, let's just have a little inflation every year, is that it allows the government to continue to compound the problem because it's able to, hide the consequences. And so it keeps getting bigger and bigger. And so ultimately, you have to default to avoid hyperinflation. And if you don't default, then you get hyperinflation. You destroy the currency. And if you think people are going to revolt from default, it's going to be worse when the money is completely worthless. right? So that's an even more dangerous way to go. And that's inevitably where you end up if you continuously inflate instead of dealing with the underlying problem. Because if you actually default, that basically, brings it to an end. Okay, we can't do this anymore. It's like you're in this giant hole, and if you can keep on inflating, you can keep on digging the hole deeper. If you have to default, that's the end of the hole digging, right? Okay, the game is over, right? Everybody knows now what's been going on. You've had to be honest. You've had to confess the problems, and now we can move on. But that never happens when you paper it all over by creating inflation. Now, is it possible that there's some kind of get out of jail free card that's waiting in the wings that is going to grow productivity so dramatically in such a short period of time that we can actually grow our way out of the debt? And I would assign a non-zero probability to that. So it's possible. And the only thing that is on the horizon that potentially could do it would maybe be artificial intelligence, if it could be implemented, if it has the ability, and we can effectively do it somehow fast enough that we can now automate so much of the production process, and the AI could come up with, because it's more intelligent than we are, could come up with even better, more efficient ways of doing things. And we could maybe create enough robots that were intelligent, that could do a lot of work, that maybe we could produce so much stuff that the economy can grow so fast that we can actually reduce the debt relative to the economy, and we can service it and repay it. I mean, I suppose that that's possible, but I don't think that's the most likely scenario. I mean, I do think that there's a lot of potential there in enhanced productivity coming from artificial intelligence and robotics and more automation. I think this is all good stuff that is going to increase the standard of living of humanity over time. But I don't know that it can lead to the results that we would need fast enough to deal with this, to mean that we don't have a crisis, that we don't have to deal with it, because the numbers are just too staggeringly big at this point. I think to grow your way out of it, even with incredible growth.
Yeah. So the AI revolution, I think, is a very interesting thing that people are holding on to. It's probably part of why some very smart people are not sounding the alarm bell as hard as I think they should. But walk me through what will happen if the government starts raising rates again. Will inflation come down? Because I've heard you put forth that even if you raise rates, inflation will go up, which is... You're the only person I've heard say that.
Well, if you just raise rates the way they did, yes, because those higher rates are part of the cost structure of businesses. I'm a business, and I have all sorts of costs. I have raw materials, I have rent, I have labor costs, and I have interest. Maybe I borrowed some money to, build out the business, to buy some capital equipment. And so I have debt, and the interest on that debt is one of my costs. And if my interest goes up, well, my costs have gone up. So that's something I'm going to pass on to the consumer with higher prices. And that's especially true for real estate. If I own some rental property, most people who own rental property have a mortgage on the rental property. And as their mortgage rates go up, because if you own a bunch of rental property, you probably didn't have a 30-year fixed rate mortgage. You probably had, a mortgage with a 5 or 7 year term, and they reset, and you have to get a higher rate. So if I'm a landlord and my interest expense has gone up, well, how do I recover that? I raise my rent. and I get it from my tenant. So higher interest rates are just another cost, just like raw materials and wages that get built into a pricing structure. So higher rates, end up being higher inflation, and that's going to happen. I mean, rates are higher now than they were when they were zero, and so that's going to affect prices. But also, the U.S. government has this massive amount of debt that has to be financed at higher interest rates, and the higher interest rates are, the bigger the deficits are, because all the money that goes to pay the interest is borrowed. And so as interest rates go up, the deficits go up. And that means there's more debt, and now you're going to have to print more money to monetize it. And so there's going to be more inflation. And also, those rising deficits are going to put downward pressure on the dollar, which we're now finally seeing. For a while, higher rates were supporting the dollar, but now that's not the case anymore. And the dollar is starting to fall, and it's going to fall a lot more because of the enormity of the deficits. And as the low-yielding debt matures, even if the Fed is cutting a bit, you're still getting debt that was borrowed at 25 basis points maturing, and now has to be rolled over at 300 or 400 basis points. So the debt is exploding because of higher interest rates, which is putting more downward pressure on the dollar, which puts upward pressure on consumer prices. But if they raised interest rates high enough to really cause a decline in aggregate demand because people stopped borrowing money, and if we had an increase in our savings rate, if people actually were like, hey, interest is so high, I'm going to earn some interest, I'm going to put my money in the bank, I'm not going to go spend it, I'm going to earn some of this high interest, then that would help fight inflation. But we never even got close to that point because the savings rate is near an all-time record low and debt is at an all-time record high. So what does that tell you? That interest rates are too low. And so when Powell comes and said we've had this tight money for a long time, money never got tight. It was less loose, but it was never tight. That's why the debt kept growing, and that's why the inflation problem is going to get a whole lot worse.
All right. Is there enough money, enough runway for inflation that they can just keep grinding inflation until they have paid off the debt?
You don't pay it off. I mean, you wipe it out, right? You make it so...
Yeah, eliminate the debt.
So it's not a burden anymore, right? It doesn't go away. But I don't see how they do that without impoverishing the whole country in the process, because they'd have to create so much inflation in order to do that, because the debt is now so big and it's rising so rapidly, right? It's rising by maybe $3 trillion a year. So even if you had 10% inflation, the debt would just stay the same in theory, but it wouldn't stay the same because the budget deficits are going to go up. But you just have to create so much inflation that, I mean, the public is not going to be able to survive the amount of inflation that they would have to create to wipe that debt out in any kind of meaningful way.
Is there any reason why? I understand that this would draw a lot of ire, people would get weird, but I've seen people get over amazingly bizarre stuff. Is there a fundamental mechanism that would stop the Fed from saying, we're going to give the US government loans at one rate and we're going to give everybody else loans at a different rate?
Well, if they're buying treasuries, see, the only way the Fed can monetize debt, it has to go into the market and buy treasuries. So I don't see how it could buy them from the government, because it doesn't actually buy them directly from the government, because it's not allowed to do that in its charter, right? They can't, because they didn't want the Federal Reserve to be able to directly monetize debt. So they were afraid of that. In fact, when the Federal Reserve Act was initially passed, it wasn't even legal for the Federal Reserve to hold U.S. treasuries. Even if they bought them in the secondary market, they couldn't do it. They were prohibited from holding them because they didn't want the Fed to be able to help the government go into debt. They changed that in soon after the Federal Reserve Act was created to help the government finance the First World War. they gave the Federal Reserve the ability to hold treasuries. And so then the Federal Reserve goes into the market, and it works through primary dealers, right? It goes through Goldman Sachs or JP Morgan or Morgan Stanley to buy its treasuries. It doesn't go Treasury direct, right? It has to go through these middlemen. So I don't see how it's possible, because they can't differentiate whose bond is whose, right? They're just buying in the market.
Okay, so this is probably just my naivete and I don't understand something, but it seems pretty trivial for the government to go, hey, everybody, guess what? We're going to default. Just kidding. The Fed's going to buy it from you, but the Fed's going to buy it from you at a discounted rate. So if you're holding bonds, Treasury right now, instead of giving you the 5.25% that we promised, we're going to give you 1.25%, but we are going to buy it. If I'm listening to this podcast and I'm a government agent, I'm like, that is a great idea. That seems inevitable, because that is far more palatable than default.
You're missing the point here. Even though the Federal Reserve, the U.S. government pays interest to the Federal Reserve, it gets the money back, right? Because the Federal Reserve has to pay its profits back to the U.S. government in a tax, 100%. The Fed is allowed to earn a certain return on its capital. And then everything it earns in excess of that is given to the U.S. government. Now, the problem is now, yes, they're earning interest, but the Fed is also losing a fortune on its bond portfolio right now. So the Fed is not making money anymore to pay the U.S. Treasury like they used to. But they do get the interest back, just like when the Federal Reserve pays interest to the so-called Social Security trust funds. It just takes the interest right back. It just yanks it right out of the trust funds and spends it. So it's a much bigger burden in the short run when the public owns the treasuries, because now that's a net drain on the current expenses of the government, because they actually have to pay the interest to a third party, right, that they don't get it back. But the real problem, though, is going to be the dollar status as the reserve currency, because as the rest of the world wakes up to the reality of endless inflation and endless money printing, and knowing that the government is not going to honestly deal with the debt, we're never going to cut back government spending, we're just going to keep creating inflation, then there is no justification for the dollar to be the reserve currency, and it won't. It will lose that status. And that is going to accelerate the spiraling of inflation out of control, because one of the reasons that we've been able to print so much money, create inflation, and haven't had an even bigger impact on our prices is because a lot of that money has been exported. You know, we have $1 trillion a year trade deficit. So these are goods that we didn't have to produce that come into the country every year. And we send our money out. We take dollars that we print and we send them to China, we send them to Japan, we send them all around the world, and they send us back real stuff. So that keeps the supply of goods up and the price of goods down, because we get the goods and the rest of the world gets the inflation. They get our money. But now what do they do with that money? They loan it back to us. They buy bonds. They buy treasury bonds. They buy corporate bonds, or they buy real estate. They buy stocks, right? They buy these financial assets. But that's helped keep asset prices high. That's helped keep interest rates low. But when they don't want these dollars anymore because they're not the reserve currency, then all those dollars are going to come back and they're going to be bidding up consumer good prices. People are going to try to buy what they can take home. But more importantly, too, all the goods stop coming in. So if we can no longer import $1 trillion worth of stuff every year, what's going to happen to prices? Prices are going to skyrocket because we're not going to have stuff. And so there's going to be a lot less stuff, yet everybody's going to be trying to buy stuff that's not there. So the prices of the stuff is going to go way up.
Yeah, maybe temporarily, because then we'd bring manufacturing back, but I don't want to derail on that.
Well,
I know you're going to put...
That's going to take, Tom, that's going to take a long time. You just can't bring manufacturing back snapping a finger. It's going to take years, maybe decades, because you have to rebuild the factories, rebuild the supply chains, train the workers. Where's the money going to come from to do this? And if we already have a huge government with lots of regulation and lots of taxes, it's going to be very difficult. I mean, that's where the AI could really come in and be helpful if we had to, start over again and rebuild our industrial base. But again, this is going to be a very difficult process that is going to take time. And in the meantime, a lot of people are going to lose a lot of money. And that's going to put a lot of pressure on a lot of politicians to do things that are going to be very harmful and very destructive to that recovery.
Yeah, I just think that the way that this will probably play out is something like this. We keep inflating. We're just going to gobble up as much money as we can by lying to you. You're going to feel that something is wrong, but you won't know exactly what it is, despite all these podcasts where I'm trying to walk people through exactly what is happening. But people aren't going to en masse. They are not going to understand what's happening. They are going to get hyper tribal because they feel like something is wrong. Apparently, the DNC is going to play the role of blaming business people. And then the economy is going to turn to trash for reasons we are going to get into great detail on in a minute. And people are going to revolt. There is going to be, if like this all goes well, there will simply be massive tribal divisions between the left and the right, and we'll seesaw the government back and forth until people do slowly get away from the dollar. But I think this will all be a feeling, and it won't be a thing that the logical brain will engage in. To your point about an honest default, that's never going to happen. That's logic. Everyone's going to steer by emotion, and it's going to manifest as political violence. That's how I think this will actually play out, because people can feel something is wrong, but it is way too hard to wrap their head around things like how the government manipulates CPI to get more money from you. Yeah. Okay, I want to go back to this. Go ahead.
I said the public already knows that things are wrong, right? That's
They
why
just know something feels wrong, but they don't know what it is.
Yeah, the politicians and a lot of the people in the financial media who still don't get it, they look at these, phony statistics and accept them on face value. And then they look at the public, and the public is so pessimistic. Biden's approval rating is so low. People are pessimistic, and they don't understand why. They say, don't they understand how great everything is? Why aren't they giving credit to the Biden administration for this great economy? And that's because the economy is not great. They're blaming Biden for the lousy economy because the economy actually is lousy. The statistics don't tell the truth if you just accept them on face value, which is why you shouldn't do that. You always have to look beneath the surface to find out what's actually happening. And if you take the time to do that and you don't just accept what amounts to propaganda, but you actually look at it, then you understand why the public is so upset, right? Because we have high unemployment, we have high inflation, and we don't even have any economic growth. We actually have a contracting economy. If you actually counted GDP, and we're going to get more GDP data later this week, but if you honestly reported the economy, it would be contracting. It is not growing. That is the problem.
Yeah. Nonetheless, people think emotionally. They do not think logically. And because of that, it becomes a question of who's going to better steer their emotions. So people are upset with Biden, but they have pulled a flip on the American people that is unreal to behold, moving everybody over to Kamala Harris. And everybody's like, yeah, word. Like, I can feel the enthusiasm now coming out of that camp. People are excited. They're revitalized. They believe it. And I'm looking at the words that she's saying and the economic policies that she is proposing, that they are terrifying, and people are here for it. They are super excited by it. And so my thing is, okay, hold on. As somebody who actually wants to see people go somewhere that leads to human flourishing, I'm just like, wait, there's a lot of excitement for policies that will not lead to, in my estimation, human flourishing. And it was very easy for the government, to the DNC very specifically, to pull a fast one, like to just be, hey, here's a new shiny object. So what do you make of that? To me, it is that is the most human story ever.
I think all this has been manufactured by the media. I can't believe that Harris is really as popular as everybody claims. I mean, she was the most unpopular vice president in history before she got the nomination. And so I don't see how she can go from being, so unpopular to being popular. The reason that Biden was unpopular was because the economy was lousy. Well, I mean, she's a big part of that. The economy is just as lousy as it was. And so how they could just think, aha, this is great, we got Harris. And in fact, Harris is simultaneously claiming that Bidenomics is a huge success, but now we need to elect her because she's going to solve all these problems. Well, what problems? If Bidenomics was such a success, there should be nothing to solve. She's talking about all the things that she's going to do if she's elected. Well, why aren't they doing those things right now? Why didn't Biden do those things? Why aren't, what, I mean, I don't know how you could fool the public. I mean, the voters are dumb, but are they really that dumb? That she's going to somehow be an agent of change, that we have great policies, but vote for me because I'm going to save you from all the problems that you now have, without accepting responsibility for having created those problems in the first place. So, I don't see how she's as popular. I mean, I think these polls, I don't know. I mean, I don't know how they're running these polls, who they're polling, who they're not polling. I mean, I know the media wants Kamala Harris to win. And so I think one of the ways they think that they can help her win is by convincing everybody that she's so popular so that they just jump on the bandwagon. And so maybe they found a way to create these polls so that they're skewed more towards a Harris. I don't know. It just seems hard that Biden would be so far behind, and then all they do is flip it to Harris, and now all of a sudden she's got a lead, or a big lead, and Trump's behind, especially given the assassination attempt, which I think really elevated Trump to almost like a living folk hero. And I think a lot of people that maybe didn't like Trump have got to at least be impressed with the way he handled that situation. And so I think that would have turned people. And now that you got a Robert Kennedy Jr., throwing his support behind him, I mean, that's got to deliver some voters to Trump that, he didn't even have before. And now he's got those voters. So, I would think that Trump would have a big lead over Harris, especially given, how bad the economy is and how much they want change. I don't think that they're really going to be dumb enough to believe that voting for 4 more years of what they've got now is change. And in fact, if anything, it's going to be worse because Harris is likely to be even more to the left of Biden. And just look at, the guy she picked for vice president. I mean, about the most liberal guy that she could have found from the most liberal state. It wasn't even like the Democrats needed Minnesota. I mean, they had that one in the bag. But Minnesota, that's, some, McGovern was from Minnesota, Mondale. I mean, a lot of real left-wing politicians have hailed from Minnesota. So I think the Harris-Walsh, duo is even worse than Biden-Harris. So, things are just going to get worse if the public votes for, more of that. Now, think the problems are going to blow up under Trump too, but Trump's got a better chance of workable solutions in the aftermath because at least he may be advised by people who believe in capitalism and believe in the free market and want to try to restore it. Harris is going to be surrounded by socialists who are going to use the crisis as an excuse to blame it on capitalism, to tell the people that capitalism doesn't work and we need to reinvent the country under a socialist economic model because this proves that capitalism doesn't work, right? So I don't want people running the country who don't even believe in capitalism, right? And obviously Harris doesn't. That's why she wants price controls, but she was raised by a communist. I mean, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. And plus, she was taught communism since she was a little kid, so she never, grew out of it.
Yeah, I think that the important thing for anybody trying to predict the future here is to understand that humans are an animal designed to use emotions to steer in an incredibly complicated world. And I don't think it's a matter of the public being dumb. I think it's a matter of we are emotional creatures. If you selectively damage the region of the brain that generates emotions, people cannot make decisions. It's not like they have a hard time making decisions. They can't do it. So emotions are fundamental to our ability to make a decision. Now you have this incredibly clean narrative with Kamala Harris with she's not Joe Biden. And so it's new, it's changed. No one's going to think about, oh, she's been there for a long time, because it's not even her, it's the party on the DNC that really does things, whatever that blobby sense of party is. And so they have the narrative they need to trigger the emotions. And this is the reason that I think both Trump and Harris have doubled down on their VP being like core to their base, is that's where we are going. Meaning the tribal split is becoming extreme because people can feel something is wrong. And this is, you and I and other very successful capitalists have got to accept the system as it is today is broken for the average person. Young people feel completely alienated. They're not even engaging. They're not even seeking romantic partners. Like it's just a level of apathy that is utterly terrifying. And so you have this split in these camps. They're doubling down. The economy isn't working in the way that it should because of the debt, way overspending. Money printing is the problem. It's not the free market. The free market, in my estimation, is not the issue. But we have an economy that we call capitalism that is leaving a lot of people out in the cold. And because of the manipulations, it is so complicated that the average person who is steering by emotions is not going to be able to identify how the magic trick is even being done. So they can just tell something is wrong, fuck you guys, burn it down, whatever normal is, gotta go. And so I'm going to go with Harris. And if she's saying that she's going to stop you from gouging me, which is clearly happening because of what I see at the pump, what I see in the grocery stores, then great. I'm here for that. That is what's going to happen. And so if she wins or loses, or Trump wins or loses, I think it will be by a razor thin margin because the country is effectively split in half.
Well, I think if Harris wins, it's the votes that are going to put her over the top are the immigrants, particularly the illegals that are here that are able to vote. Because remember, Donald Trump is promising to deport the illegal immigrants, and Harris wants to, not only give them asylum, but give them all kinds of freebies. So if you're an illegal alien and you're in this country, you're voting for Harris. Now, of course, you're not even supposed to vote, right? The whole thing is if you're not an American citizen, legally you can't vote, but they're voting anyway. So I think that Harris is going to win the overwhelming number of the illegal votes. And so if she wins, that's going to be the only reason. I just can't see an honest election where just American citizens are able to vote. I can't see how Harris wins that election. Because, Trump is not actually promising to cut any government programs. He should be, right? That's what we need to do. But he's not promising to cut anything, right? And so he shouldn't be alienating anybody. If he was running an honest campaign, look, we got to cut Social Security, he may risk losing some votes of people who are getting Social Security. But he's not. He's not promising that at all. He's promising to raise Social Security. He's not saying we're gonna cut, Medicare. No, he's talking about, no tax on tips, which is a tax cut for a lot of people. So Trump is not saying, vote for me, I'm going to take away any of your government benefits. So he's promising more government also. It's just that at least he's different. Everybody now, the economy is so bad. People are struggling. Everybody is going to vote to throw the bums out. Who are the bums? It's Harris and it's Biden. And so Biden's taking himself out of the game, but Harris is still there. They got to throw her out. She's got to be fired. Right? So the electorate is going to get rid of Harris if it's a fair election, if it's an honest election. So the question is, if she doesn't win, it's because you've had these illegals voting, or they somehow rigged the system, and they found some votes, and she was able to win. Because I don't see how she would win, given the realities of how bad things are. And a lot of people could just remember what things were like when Trump was president. It wasn't that long ago. He was president 4 years ago. Everybody, knows things are a lot worse today than they were 4 years ago. So if it's a litmus test on are you better off today than you were 4 years ago, very few people could say yes. Most people are going to say, no, I was better off 4 years ago, and so I'm voting Trump, right? And so that's what should happen, in a fair, honest election. And not that, things are going to get better under Trump. Things are going to get worse regardless of who wins the election. But the voters don't know that. They're not smart enough to realize. Trump says, I'm going to get rid of inflation on day one. The voters might believe him, even though he can't do it. He's not going to do it with the policies he's proposing. But it sounds more believable than Harris doing it. How is Harris going to get rid of it? She was there when it happened. I mean, Trump could say, look, when I was president, inflation was 1%, right? Technically, according to the CPI, right, that's where it was. And so now it's much higher. And so it's easier to hang that on Biden and Harris. So he should win. But again, the problem is nobody would win an election telling the truth. If Donald Trump says, look, I'm going to solve the problems, that we're going to have massive cuts to government spending, and people who are getting checks from the government, you're going to get smaller checks. Right? I got to cut Social Security. I got to cut government pensions. I got to cut defense. I don't think you win on that ticket, on that. Things have to get really, really bad. See, Milei in Argentina, he was able to win on that because things have been so bad for so long. The public finally decided that, you know what, let's try that. We've tried everything else. We've tried all these government solutions, and none of them have worked. So maybe let's try capitalism, right? Let's get rid of all this government because it can't get any worse. And let's try it this way. Let's try cutting government instead of expanding government. And let's try freedom instead of socialism. And, and so they're trying it. And hopefully they stick with it because it's going to work. But Americans, we haven't had enough socialism yet to be sick of it. We still don't get it. We still think the government can solve our problems and don't recognize that all the problems we want the government to solve, the government created.
Okay, why specifically? Actually, before we get to that, let me ask, I'm going to preempt the comment section. How on earth are illegal immigrants going to vote?
They just show up at the polls and vote. Right? They don't.
Do we have evidence of that, or do we just have because obviously that would violate?
They're voting. We know
I don't know
voting.
that. How do we know that?
They are, and in some states too. They can get an ID, they can get a driver's license without proving they're a citizen or whatever, and then they go and they have an ID and they vote. But people. I mean, that's one of the reasons that so many illegals are coming into the country. When the Democrats look at all these illegals as new voters that are just coming over. Right, just coming across the border, they think, that's another guy that can vote for me, and so that's what's going on. I mean, who knows how many illegals voted in the 2020 election?
Okay, I think that's going to be a very divisive theory that you're putting out there. Help me understand.
I don't even think it's controversial at this point. I mean, it's kind of like a fact that they're coming here and they're voting. That's why there was a bill. They're trying to stop the illegals from voting, but the Democrats don't want to stop them from voting because they're getting the votes.
Peter, I think that might not be controversial in your audience, but this is very controversial as you go out to a broader audience. Like there is a violent kickback. I don't know if you saw Elon Musk had a tweet, and hey, for all of his divisiveness, this one seemed abnormally divisive, where he said, hey, the master plan is to get these guys ultimately a path to citizenship so they can vote. And people still had just a flip out over that, like that he was being asinine. That's absolutely outrageous. And why would they ever suggest that? And so again, this may break evenly along party lines, but I think that's one of the more controversial statements you have thrown out in this interview thus far. Do you have anything, if people want to look into this, is there somewhere that they can go that shows data, not just sort of gut sense?
Well, I mean, I know that there are a lot of people vote and they're not necessarily getting checked for IDs. There are a lot of places that you don't even need an ID to vote. And there are ways that you can get IDs and not be a citizen. But in order to vote in a federal election. Like the states could make any laws they want for their own elections, for their local, positions. If they want to allow, just illegals to vote or just, anybody, they can let whoever they want vote in their own state. But when it comes to a national election for a president, for Congress, you got to be an American. I mean, I can't even vote for the president, even though I am an American citizen. I live in Puerto Rico. And so none of the American citizens who live in Puerto Rico are allowed to vote. Now, if I move back to the US, then I can vote. But I can't even vote, and I'm actually an American. But now we've got a lot of people who aren't even Americans because they happen to be in one of the 50 states. They may be able to get to the polls and vote. And some of them, they don't even have to, they vote, on a ballot, right? They just vote, on the mail. They get a ballot in the mail and they send it in. But I don't think that there is enough going on to prevent people who shouldn't be voting from voting. But hopefully in this election, maybe there'll be more of that. Maybe people are kind of onto this and they want to make sure that the votes that are cast are legal votes. But the big problem too, and you thought that was controversial, the problem is democracy itself, which we're not even supposed to be. If you are familiar with the U.S. founding documents, read the Declaration of Independence, read the Constitution, read the Bill of Rights. The word democracy does not appear once in either of those documents. We're not supposed to be a democracy. The only thing that's in the Constitution is republic. It says in the Constitution that every state in the Union shall be guaranteed a republican form of government. In the Bill of Rights, there is no right to vote, right? You have freedom of speech, freedom of the press, there's all kinds of freedoms. There is nothing in the Constitution that says anybody has a right to vote, because nobody had a right to vote. Voting was considered a privilege, and the states decided who could exercise that privilege. There were all sorts of qualifications. When our country was first established, there were all sorts of things. Most states, you had to be 21, right? Most states, you had to be male. And a lot of states, all states pretty much, you had to be male. But then you had to, have property, you had to pay a tax, you had to pass a literacy test. There was all sorts of things that limited who could vote. Because the idea wasn't just everybody voting. The idea was we wanted good government. How are we going to get good government? Well, we have to limit the people who are allowed to vote. Because if we let everybody vote, we're going to have idiots in government. Because, the average person is, going to vote for some idiot because they're not, going to know. And so they tried to restrict the voting. But of course, we also had all sorts of laws to protect the minorities from the majority. So even if bad people got elected, the government, the Constitution, limited what the federal government could do anyway. So even if the population elected somebody that wanted to do something, chances were he was prohibited from doing it by the Constitution, because the Constitution was written with very limited powers for the federal government. The federal government's powers are few and defined. Yet now the government does just about everything it wants because the judges don't really enforce the Constitution the way it was supposed to be enforced. They let the government get away with all sorts of stuff. And now all the protections that the founding fathers created to protect America from the evils of democracy, they called it mobocracy, those protections, those checks and balances no longer really exist. And so now we've got everybody voting. And so we've got this horrible economy because people are voting for free stuff. I forget who said this, but I think it was de Tocqueville that said that an election is an advanced auction on the sale of stolen goods. And that's what people are doing. They're voting for to receive the goods that the people they vote for steal from other people and give to them. But that is the inherent problem, is that we're not the republic that we were meant to be. We've become more of a democracy. We're not a direct democracy where people don't vote directly for every law. We still have representatives that vote for us, but the way those representatives are getting elected is just one man, one vote. One man, one woman. I mean, the only people who can't vote legally are people who are under 18. But there are a lot of Democrats that want to lower that. They want to, the age should be higher. I mean, 21. When the states had 21 as the age, when a man was 21 in 1800, he had a wife, he had a few kids, he'd probably been in the workforce for 5 or 6 years. He had a lot more experience than an 18-year-old today who's never had a job and lives with his parents. So, I mean, people shouldn't be voting when they're 18. I mean, it should be probably 30 at a minimum.
Wowza. Okay, well, let's drill down. What would you want to see actual regulations put around as it relates to voting? I'm going to guess it isn't men only. I hope not, for your sake.
Well, it doesn't make... Back in 1790, women voting didn't make sense. It was an easy way to eliminate a bunch of uninformed voters because women didn't work. Women stayed at home. They took care of the house. And so, they didn't necessarily, know who to vote for. They might just vote for whoever their husband was voting for. It's a very different world today. So if I were trying to create criteria for who should vote and who shouldn't vote, sex would not make sense to use that as, only males or, it doesn't, sex is not something that should matter because women are just as likely to be out in the workforce and, and knowledgeable about, various issues as the men might. Because the sex roles are very different today than they were a couple hundred years ago. So that wouldn't be a factor. But age would still be a big factor. I think that the voting age should be a lot higher. Certainly, we should have literacy tests. I mean, you should have to be able to read and write. I mean, you'd have to, to be able to vote. I like, the property qualifications to say, hey, you have to have accumulated some property, have some skin in the game. I mean, people think, why should, the poor people or people that don't own property or, why shouldn't they be able to vote? The whole idea is just to have good government, not to have everybody voting. Look, I would rather have qualifications for voting that excluded me, right? That I didn't even meet the qualifications, but I knew that the people who met the qualifications were a good group of people who were going to exercise the privilege to vote in such a way that we were going to have good government. That good government would benefit me, even if I didn't get a chance to vote for it. I'd rather have that than have everybody vote where my vote gets canceled out by some idiot, and then we end up with really bad government. So I'd rather have good government that I don't vote for than bad government that I do vote for. But the key is, too, if you have a government that really can't do anything, right, then I don't even have to worry. Right? Because if the government is just there to protect individual rights, private property, my right to life, liberty, just to protect me from people who would infringe on my rights, then even, what difference does it make if I can vote or not? Because the government can't really do anything. The reason that people want to vote now is because they want the government to give them something. They want the government to take money from the people who didn't vote for them and give it to the people who did. But once you take that power away from government, if the government can't give anything to the people who vote for them, well, then there's nothing in it, right? All we want is good, honest government. And you don't get that with one man, one woman, one vote. I mean, there is no historical precedence for getting that. The key is to restrict it. And if you look at how America was first founded, the senators weren't elected by the people. They were appointed by the state legislatures. That changed around 1900. They amended the Constitution so that the people could elect the senators, but that wasn't how it was. And even the president, everybody knows about the Electoral College, but it wasn't supposed to be a rubber stamp. We were supposed to vote for electors, and then the electors were supposed to decide who the president and vice president was going to be, right? They weren't pledged. There was an actual real convention, and they were supposed to be smarter than the people, and then they would pick who would be there. But we had so many checks and balances. They couldn't do things. We had the Supreme Court that would strike down if they wanted to do something that was unconstitutional. The Supreme Court would strike it down. They rarely strike down anything anymore. because there's so many holes in the Constitution now based on the way they they redefined the necessary and proper clause or the commerce clause or all these things, which basically negated the Constitution and made the whole thing meaningless because of how they call it interpreting, but they're really ignoring it is what they're doing. They're trying to allow the government to do things that are clearly prohibited by the Constitution. But now you have all this stuff that's being done, and you have everybody just getting elected. And people keep thinking, oh, it's so important that everybody vote. No, it's not. I mean, why would you want some idiot to go vote, right? And just cancel out your vote. If they're going to vote, people are going to vote for socialism. I don't want that, right? I mean, socialism is pretty appealing to people who don't know anything, right? It's very easy to vote your way into socialism. The problem is you can hardly ever vote your way out of it. Usually you have to fight your way out of it. Right? You need an armed rebellion. But a lot of the most tyrannical governments, I mean, Adolf Hitler was elected, right? I mean, how do you think he came to power? A lot of these tyrants, are people vote for them, right? And then they end up with this horrible government. So that's not the type of the government I like, where you just vote yourself into a socialist totalitarian society. I'd rather have a monarchy than that. I mean, I actually think a constitutional monarchy is probably a better form of government than just having a democracy. And I don't think if the framers would have gone for democracy, they would have made George Washington a king. In fact, they offered to make him a king. He didn't want to be a king, and so we had a republic. And that's why Benjamin Franklin, when he was asked, "What kind of government did you create for us, Mr. Franklin?" he said, "A republic, if you could keep it." And the "if you could keep it" part wasn't necessarily because he thought it might become a monarchy. He was afraid that it might devolve, into a democracy, and they knew that didn't work, right? They were, unlike today's government officials. They understood history. They studied the failed democracies of ancient Greece. They knew that didn't work. So they created a republic, and that worked for a long time in America. I mean, we thrived as we kept democracy in check. We saw the greatest expansion of living standards for the masses in the 19th century. We've never had economic growth since. With all of our new technology, we've never had the economic growth that we had in the 1870s, the 1880s, 1890s, 1900s. This is before everybody was voting. And back then, we didn't have an income tax. We didn't have a social security tax. We didn't have a minimum wage. We didn't have any of this stuff. We didn't have any of these government programs. Government was tiny. Federal government was an afterthought. And we became the most prosperous nation in the history of the world. It was only after we started voting for all this big government, right, that we've created all these problems, and that we've seen such a dramatic decline in our living standards, especially on a relative basis relative to the rest of the world. I mean, countries that we're way ahead of, we're now behind.
I think we're going to have a hard time getting people to wrap their heads around inflation. Going to a constitutional monarchy is probably outside the scope of where we'll be able to influence people. Those are really interesting things to think about, just to plant my own flag, so I don't get swept up in some of those things. I am hyper paranoid about people that manage to convince themselves that they're smart enough that they want to tell people how things should go. So I get it. I understand that democracy is going to have deep and abiding flaws. But yeah, I think that saying these people can vote, these people can't vote in a very restricted, the property was where you lost me. I'll be really honest. That is a bridge too far for me.
Property qualifications were pretty common, owning property.
But that's how you become feudalistic, man. That's how you get this permanent underclass of people that really do fall under the tyranny of people who are going to vote selfishly, as everybody does. And so you rob the one thing from people, which is the ability to express their voice in a nonviolent way, to say, this is the thing that I want. And even if it's just a yardstick to see the screaming of a group of people that feel that they're not being heard, it's like, if you don't let them vote and have that tally at least marked, you're going to have problems, I think. Anyway,
Yeah, I
I
mean,
know
you
we could
could
go back and
have-
forth.
you-
Oh God, Peter, you made such good points. I heard them all, but I want to get us back to something a little more tangible and today, right now. So some ideas that are being floated economically right now are to tax unrealized gains. I found that terrifying. A $25,000 credit to first-time home buyers. How could that go wrong? That sounds great, but I have thoughts. Medical debt forgiveness, again, sounds amazing, but I have feeling that goes wrong. There's a sort of general thing that groups those three things together, which is they all sound awesome. They sound like they're going to make things better for people that are struggling. Why won't those things, or maybe they will, but my thesis is those will actually make things worse for people that are struggling. How could that ever be true?
Well, first of all, just giving people money to buy houses, again, apart from being unconstitutional, which it is, it's just going to increase housing demand. People are going to take that money and use it to bid up houses, and so prices are going to go up. And so if the problem is that housing prices are too high, giving people money to buy houses is just going to make those prices even higher. So it is a foolish, misguided policy that is going to worsen the very problem that they're trying to solve. I mean, the real solution is to get the government out of the housing market completely. They've been very involved in it for a long time. It really started under FDR, but all these programs to make homes more affordable have backfired and made them a lot more expensive, which is exactly what the government does. So that is the worst possible policy, other than maybe this tax on unrealized gains, which, number one, again, would also be unconstitutional because they want to try to tax unrealized gains as if they are income. But they are not income. They are unrealized gains. That is not income. Income is a realized gain. You have to sell something and receive more than you paid for it to have income that is subject to tax under the 16th Amendment. See, the reason we have a 16th Amendment is because the Constitution basically prohibited an income tax, a direct tax, unless it was apportioned. And the government, didn't want to apportion it for all sorts of reasons, because the founding fathers didn't want direct taxes. They wanted direct taxes in emergencies like a war. So they made it very difficult for the government to lay a direct tax, which is a tax that the people have to pay directly to the government, as opposed to an excise tax, which they thought the government would run on, which is like a sales tax, tax on alcohol, tobacco, gas. You buy a product, the tax is there, you pay it, easy. You don't need an accountant. You don't need to, file a return. You don't need to, risk going to jail, right? It's very simple to pay an excise tax. So that was how the government was supposed to run. Well, when they initially wanted to impose the income tax, the politicians said, look, we'll tax the rich, and the middle class won't have to pay taxes anymore. We'll get rid of the tariffs that you guys have been paying, and we're going to tax the Carnegies and the Vanderbilts and the Rockefellers, this income tax. And so that's how we got it, because the public voted for a tax they didn't believe they would ever have to pay. But of course, now the middle class pays taxes that nobody would have imagined Carnegie and Rockefeller and Vanderbilt would have paid. The initial tax was, I think, capped at 4% on the billionaires, right? It was a tiny little tax. But the 16th Amendment is what authorized it, but it has to be on income. So the only direct tax that can be constitutionally levied without apportionment is an income tax. So now, if the government says, we're going to try to tax the unrealized gains that you have on an asset that you own, that is not an income tax. That is a property tax. They're taxing your stocks, they're taxing real estate, they're taxing the asset that has appreciated. So that is completely unconstitutional. But now, let's assume that they do it anyway, right? And the Supreme Court, for whatever reason, doesn't strike it down. It would be a complete disaster to impose that type of tax, because it would destroy the economy. Because anybody that owns these appreciated assets would be forced to sell the assets to pay the tax. And you would destroy the accumulated capital of the country. I mean, the key to capitalism is capital. You want to allow capital to accumulate because that's, what drives the economy. That's what helps produce all the goods and services, is the fact that we have capital. But if we have to destroy the capital so that we can pay a tax to the government, we're just, turning all that capital into consumption. So it would be highly inflationary. It would be very economically destructive. Lots of people would try to figure out how to get the hell out of the country. Nobody would want to start a business here anymore. Nobody would want to own assets here anymore. I mean, it would be a horrible tax economically. Even, apart from the fact that it's illegal to actually do it. But and again, if they do pass something like this, remember, it's the camel's nose under the tent. That's always how a new tax is sold. It's sold to the voter with a promise that you won't have to pay it. Here is a new tax that some rich guy is going to pay, and it's not going to cost you anything. Oh, okay, yes, I'm in favor of that. But then once they get it passed, it rapidly changes so that now the very people who were told they wouldn't have to pay the tax are the ones that pay the most. The middle class suffers the biggest burden from a tax that they never were even going to pay. And in fact, the withholding tax didn't even start until the Second World War. So even though we passed the income tax in 1913, nobody had taxes withheld from their pay until 1943. And that was because we were fighting a war. And so the government said, hey, we need to do this temporarily because, we got to fight this war. We need the money. And so we got that temporary withholding tax. And of course, we still have it. Here it is 2024. And people are still having taxes withheld from their pay. But again, this is why, if we tied voting to taxation, that would be another way you could do it. Because it's very easy to vote for a tax that you're not going to have to pay. Because that's really like voting for theft. A politician says, yeah, vote for me and I'm going to steal money from this rich guy and give it to you. Well, okay, right. Whose vote do you lose? Well, I lose the vote of the rich guy, but there's not as many of those as there are the people who are going to get the stolen money. And so that's what happens. But all these policies that she's proposing on top of the price gouging. There is no price gouging. The prices are set by supply and demand. The prices are what the prices are. Especially supermarkets. Supermarkets, grocery stores are highly competitive. They have razor thin margins. Nobody could gouge because they would go out of business. You go shop someplace else. Every supermarket is trying to give the customer the best deal they possibly can. So prices are low. But the reason they've gone up is because the government's created inflation. And so prices have got to go up when the government creates inflation. If the supermarkets or grocery stores didn't raise their prices, they'd go out of business. And in fact, that's what these price controls would do. They would result in a lot of grocery stores going out of business, especially in the inner cities, in the communities where they have higher costs. There's higher insurance, higher crime, higher minimum wages. Those are going to be the first stores to shut down. And so, the food's not going to be there, right? There's not going to be any, again, you're going to have to wait in line for a long time because they're going to end up rationing what food they have left. And to the extent that you really want to get something, you're going to buy it illegally on the black market. And, it's going to cost a lot more. So everything that she has proposed is just going to make the problems worse. The high cost of housing, the high cost of food is because of the government creating inflation. And everything Harris wants to do is to create even more inflation. And in fact, that was the biggest irony, was the Inflation Reduction Act was an act to increase inflation. There's no truth in legislating, right? If there was, they'd all be in jail for the Inflation Reduction Act because it's false advertising. It's lying. The Inflation Reduction Act increased inflation because they expanded the money supply. They voted for the government to spend more money that the Fed was going to have to print, right? So that was the Inflation Creation Act. In fact, it was really the Green New Deal relabeled so the public would accept it. And now they want to claim credit. Hey, we passed the Inflation Reduction Act. Yeah, that was just the title, right? In fact, if you want to know what a government bill is going to do, just read the title and then it's the opposite. Like if they pass tax simplification, it's going to make taxes a lot more complicated. They tend to put a title on a bill that is the opposite of what the bill is actually going to achieve.
That's good times. Why are price controls impossible to do well? Like if they were going to go in this and really try to be nuanced and understand, I'm dealing with a company that has razor thin margins. We don't want to crush these small businesses. We know most people are doing it right. We just really want to make sure that everybody's taken care of. Why fundamentally does that still go wrong?
Well, first of all, in order for the government to, try to figure out what the price should be of any given item, because first of all, there's so many different items on the shelf, right? So some government bureaucratic board is going to have to be appointed, and they're going to have to figure out what the price of a banana should be, or what the price of a can of Coca-Cola should be, or all these different items. Who's going to do that? How much is that going to cost? And then how are the supermarkets going to comply with these rules and regulations? How are they going to prove to the government that the prices they're charging are, within what their requirements are? All of this is going to cost a lot of money to administer. Where's that money going to come from? Where are the grocery stores going to get all the money? They're going to have to hire a bunch of people now to fill out forms and to keep track of numbers and to get the permission from the government to charge. Where are they going to get all that money? They got to raise their prices. So anything that the government does that imposes more regulation on a business is going to result in higher prices for whatever business is being regulated. But also, they don't need to do that. They can't do that. We already have something called supply and demand, and we have competition. Those things together set prices, and it prevents somebody from ripping off the customer. Because while I don't think everybody is smart enough to vote, I do think everybody is smart enough to shop. You see, the people who want everybody to vote think the people are a bunch of idiots and the government has to protect them from everything. I think they're smart enough not to shop at a grocery store that's overcharging, right? So, you're a consumer, right? You have choice. There's a free market. And if one grocery store is too expensive, you won't shop there. You'll go someplace else, right? And in fact, you got the internet now. You can shop around. You can see where the prices are the best. So it's competition that is going to make sure no one gets ripped off. When the government comes in, everybody gets ripped off. Everybody gets ripped off by the government. Instead of Kamala Harris worried about non-existent price gouging by the free market, she should worry about the actual gouging that's being done by the government on the people. The people are being gouged with inflation and taxes, and they have no way around it, right? The government creates it. In the free market, it's all voluntary. Nobody can exploit me. No one can gouge me because nobody owns my business. I can take my business anywhere I want. I'm going to go to the company that offers me the best deal, the highest quality, the lowest price. That's where I'm going, right? And the market is going to make sure. But with the government, when they have power and they have the guns, I don't have a choice, right? I have to pay their inflation tax no matter what. If they tax my income, even if I get a lousy deal, I can't opt out, right? I'm paying the tax. I'm being forced to pay that tax. So the government takes my money by force. A grocery store gets my money because I volunteered to give it to them. They didn't force me. They didn't come to my house with a gun and force me to shop at their store and pay their prices. They convinced me to stop at their store because they had the best prices, or they had the cleanest aisles, or the shortest line, or whatever it was that caused me to go to that grocery store. I went there voluntarily. I could have gone to any other store, but I chose the one that I went to. I'm not going to choose the one that's ripping me off, right? Nobody is that dumb, but the government somehow thinks we're all that dumb, and we're all going to make dumb decisions unless they come in and protect us, yet we're all smart enough to vote. Right? We're too dumb to know where to buy groceries, but we know how to pick the president. See, I think it's the opposite. We're smart enough to know how to buy groceries, but everybody shouldn't be picking the president.
All right. If we know that we're in an everything bubble and it is destined to burst because of what's going on with the debt, inflation, interest rate, that whole conundrum, and the policies that are on the horizon are not anything that's going to save us from that. In fact, from what you're saying, there is no saving us from that other than an honest default, which isn't really saving. How do people navigate this moment well? What do people do in an inflationary environment with terrible government policy?
Yeah, well, I mean, the advice that I've been given to people for years, first of all, when it comes to goods that don't perish, I've been advising people, even before the pandemic, I've been saying this consistently, is just stock up on things, right? Everything that you need, right? Let's say razor blades, right? They don't go bad, right? If if you buy the razor blades that you're going to use over the next 5 or 10 years, you just buy them and put them in the, in a storage closet or something. Then you could just use those razor blades instead of going out and buying new ones, because the new ones are going to keep getting more and more expensive. So you might as well stock up on them. Bars of soap or cleaning detergent or certain food items that, that have a long shelf life. If you buy the things that you need in the future, but buy them now, they're, it's like an investment. I mean, if I buy a can of beans and a year from now, that can of beans is 20% more expensive than it was. If I buy it now, it's like a 20% return on my investment, right? And I don't pay taxes on that.
This is doomer prepping. Is that really your go-to advice right now? Or if I'm honest, I thought the answer was going to be something like getting gold and other things that are resistant to inflation. But we went to buy razor blades and canned beans, Peter. This is not the answer I was expecting.
A lot of people don't have enough money to buy gold, right? So they,
but then can they buy a bunch of beans and razor blades?
Well, they know what they're going to need. If you know that you're going to want things, why wait till the price goes way up? If you have a little extra cash, you could just, keep a bigger supply of those things in your house. Now, obviously, if you've got a lot of extra money, if I've got $10,000 at the end that I didn't spend, I'm not going to buy $10,000 worth of beans and razor blades. Now I can start buying some gold and silver, because I could use that to buy food or buy razor blades in the future, because those prices will go up too. See, if razor blades are 20% more expensive in the future, gold might be 20% more expensive too, or maybe 30%. So I could use my gold in the future to buy razor blades, or I could sell my gold and I could use the cash to buy razor blades. So you can protect yourself from inflation by buying the goods that you need now, or by buying things like gold and silver that will go up in value, and you'll be able to use them to buy more expensive goods. You don't want to save cash. You don't want to take your dollars and put them in a bank and spend them a year from now, because they'll buy a lot less a year from now than they would buy right now. So either spend those dollars right now on goods, or turn them into real money that you could save instead of fiat currency like gold or silver, which you could do. And that's why I've got Schiff Gold. I mean, I'm telling people all the time, give us a call at Schiff Gold, buy some precious metals if you have any savings, if you have money that you haven't spent. Problem is, so many people have nothing left over. They can barely get by. They've got credit card debt. So for those people, just buying some extra things at the market, that might be all they could do, just to have a, good supply of stuff that not only could it get more expensive, but it could be out of it. They could be shortages of some of these things, especially if we end up having price controls. Now, if you have even more money, right? If you have hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars that you want to protect, right? Now you need a bigger plan. Now you need a bigger strategy. And that's what I do at my asset management company, Europe Pacific Asset Management. When you have inflation, inflation destroys paper assets, and it transfers wealth from creditors to debtors, right? Debtors win when you have a big run of inflation, and creditors lose. We talked about that earlier. The U.S. government wants to wipe out its debt with inflation. Well, when the U.S. government wipes out its own debt, it's also wiping out everybody else's debt. So the debtors win with inflation. The creditors lose. The people who own the debt, who loan the money, they're the losers. So you want to have a portfolio that will protect you from inflation. So what don't you want to own in your portfolio? You don't want U.S. bonds. You don't want municipal bonds. You don't want treasuries. You don't want corporate bonds. None of the interest rates that you are earning on those bonds will come anywhere near returning the purchasing power that you lose to inflation. So you want to get rid of all those things. And you want to have a portfolio of assets that will retain their value. And what I've been recommending, and what I do, is I look around the world for companies that I think represent good investment value, that pay high dividends to their shareholders, which would be me and my clients who own the stock. And I want companies that have pricing power, that can raise their prices when inflation raises their costs. They can pass those higher costs on to their customers, and their customers won't leave, right? Because some things that happen with inflation is you have to raise prices high enough and you lose your customers because they can't afford your product anymore. Well, I want businesses that are selling products that people need. So they're going to buy them no matter what. I mean, they may buy a little less, but they're going to give up something else because they need those products. So you want to own businesses that are selling goods and services that are in real demand, that consumers are going to keep buying even if the prices go up, and then your dividend is going to go up, so you'll have cash flow that will go up to help with your rising cost of living. And the stocks that I'm buying are almost all outside the United States, because now I have the added benefit of earning foreign currencies that I believe are going to appreciate dramatically against the US dollar, especially once the dollar really loses its reserve currency status and you see a huge decline in the dollar, not just absolute terms like it has been falling, but in relative terms where the dollar really starts to fall against the other fiat currencies. And the last piece of that puzzle is when the dollar loses its status as the reserve currency, I think that basically removes a giant burden from the rest of the world. Because while America benefits from this status with a huge subsidy, the rest of the world bears that cost. They have to pay us. We live beyond our means, but that means that the rest of the world collectively lives beneath its means to make it possible. We consume stuff that we didn't produce. They produce stuff that they don't consume. But when the dollar crashes, then we're going to consume a lot less in America, but the rest of the world is going to consume a lot more, in particular the emerging markets. So I think there's a lot to be gained, because as Americans see their standard of living decline, you're going to see a lot of other people in the world, particularly in those emerging markets, that are going to see their standard of living rise, right? Because now they're going to be able to buy goods with their money instead of U.S. treasuries or whatever else, their governments have been recycling their trade surpluses into. So you want to own companies that are going to profit from that. And so I'm building these portfolios, dividend-paying portfolios of real assets that I think will preserve wealth. I think a lot of people are going to get wiped out. A lot of people in my generation that have large portfolios that they're living on, where they're clipping coupons on their muni bonds and on corporate bonds, I think they're going to get wiped out. I think inflation is going to completely destroy them. That's why they should get rid of their dollars while they can, sell out these assets while they can, and get a portfolio that is, positioned to deal with the level of inflation that I see coming.
All right. So if you're the dividend side, I understand, but if you're getting foreign currency into your portfolio, I'm assuming you're only doing that in foreign currencies that you have reason to believe are not going to inflate their currency at the same rate that the US is. What are currencies that you have that level of faith in?
Well, all the currencies are going to be inflated. So it's not a question of, even the Swiss franc, right? The dollar is very close to hitting an all-time record low against the Swiss franc, but they have inflation in Switzerland. When we went off the gold standard, you could buy it cost you 23 cents to buy a Swiss franc in 1971. And now it costs about $1.20 to buy a Swiss franc. So, it costs 5 times as much. The dollar has lost 80% of its value relative to the Swiss franc. But even during that period of time, the Swiss franc doesn't buy what it used to. So it's a question of, I'm investing in currencies that I think will lose value more slowly than the dollar, which means they'll appreciate versus the dollar. But I'm still investing in companies in those countries that I believe can raise their prices. And when you own a business, you own the real assets of that business. And so those assets maintain their value. What you don't want to own is the bonds of that business, because then you get wiped out. to inflation. But if you own the business, which means you own the plant and equipment, the intangibles, the patents, whatever they have that's real, you own that. And so if the government just prints money, well, then, you don't lose any of that. The prices of all that stuff just goes up to reflect the fact that there's more money. But if you own bonds, you get, completely screwed when they create inflation. In fact, a lot of people look at treasuries and they say, oh, treasuries are a safe haven. Not from inflation. They're not a safe haven from that. You're right in the line of fire, right? You're ground zero, right? The people who are going to lose the most to inflation are people who think they're playing it safe in U.S. treasuries. They get wiped out to inflation.
Okay, a couple mile markers. So one, that would be true of treasuries if and only if the rate of inflation is higher than the return that you get. Otherwise, I would expect that to sort of be on par, that you're sort of treading water. What specific examples can you give us of currencies that you are happy to be intaking flows in, understanding that it's a differential between how much the U.S. inflates and how much they inflate?
Yeah, I mean, look, the currencies that are probably the best, the Singapore dollar, the yuan in South Korea, the Scandinavian currencies, the franc. But we've got income coming in euros, in pounds. I mean, these currencies are still experiencing inflation, and so I expect that that's going to continue. We also have earnings coming in from Southeast Asia, from a number of currencies. Thailand, the Philippines, Malaysia. I mean, we're earning income. Our businesses are selling products in these markets, and so all those dividends, when we get paid, we convert them to dollars to give them to our customers. But obviously, the lower the dollar is, the more dollars we get when we convert the dividends. And the companies, if it's a multinational company and if it's based in the UK, we're getting pounds, but that company's earnings may not be in pounds. If, let's say it's a UK company, but 80% of its sales are outside the UK. So then you got to look at, where are the sales coming from, because that's where they're earning their income. But I think that the dollar is going to lose value relative to that basket of currencies, especially when it's no longer the reserve currency, because we enjoy this privilege. And so the dollar has an artificially high value based on that status. And so when that status is lost, it's going to be huge. And when you talk about, I'm in treasuries and I'm getting 3 or 4%, and inflation is 3 or 4%. Well, it's not 3 or 4%. If the government says it's 3 or 4%, it's 8 or 8%. So you're not treading water. You're actually going down. But I think we're going to see a sudden spike in inflation that is completely unanticipated by the bond markets, where all of a sudden we can go from single digit to double digit inflation, but where the first digit is not a 1. So all of a sudden we have a couple of years where inflation's 30 or 40%, and that wipes out bonds almost completely. Like, you just destroy the value in just a couple of years. You just wipe out the value of a bond portfolio, because you just get a sudden and unexpected burst in inflation, and you're locked into your yield, right? You got a 3-year treasury.
What would cause that?
A big drop in the dollar. Yeah, if we have a precipitous drop in the dollar, let's say the dollar index right now is at 80, right? At 100. So let's say 101. Let's say the dollar index got cut in half over the next couple of years, down to 50, which could happen, right? It's never been that low. The all-time record low is about 70. But if you saw a precipitous drop in the value of the dollar because there was a run on the dollar, and there was people who were worried about treasuries, then you could see a massive increase in prices in the United States very quickly. I mean, you've seen that in other countries. You see that when their currency gets clobbered, and then they have massive inflation. And especially with the U.S., we import so much stuff. We rely so heavily on imports.
Yeah, but this is a confidence game. So I'm just curious what you think would shake the global market's belief in the dollar. Is this something like BRICS? where, hey, they're like, let me just run a pretend scenario. You tell me if I'm on the right path here. China announces, hey, we faked you guys out with not buying gold for a month, but now we're actually buying it 3 or 4 times the rate. We're going to be announcing a new BRICS currency that's pegged to gold. And Russia and a bunch of other countries are like 100% of our purchasing of petrol is going to be in this new petrol BRICS dollar, whatever. And people are like, oh God, it's all happening. And now the value of the dollar goes down. Is it going to be something like that?
Well, they always say it's never a problem until it's a problem, right? Well, of course, then it's a crisis. But if you look at anybody that's had a sovereign debt problem or currency problem, it comes on very suddenly. Look, I'm here in Puerto Rico, and for years and years, Puerto Rico was borrowing a lot of money, and it was obvious that they were borrowing more money than they could repay. But the bond market didn't care. The lenders kept loaning Puerto Rico more money, and so Puerto Rico kept spending it and borrowing more. And then all of a sudden, the market started to worry about the ability of Puerto Rico to repay its debt. And so people didn't want to loan more money to Puerto Rico. And the people who already loaned their money wanted it back. And then there was a crisis and Puerto Rico defaulted on the debt. Right? Same thing happened in Greece. Greece had a big problem, but they were broke for a long time before anybody cared. I mean, it's like, you can keep on borrowing money until you get that point. And there's going to come a point in time where the world doesn't want to loan any more money to a bankrupt nation that has no ability to repay its debts. The only way that we can pay our debts is by creating inflation, which doesn't count. Right? I mean, people think, well, the U.S. government will never default, which, they might. Again, that's better than inflation. But we have defaulted in the past. In 1971, we defaulted on our commitment to pay gold. We had made a promise to the world. We told the world, if you have 35 Federal Reserve notes, whenever you want, you can get an ounce of gold. That was the deal we made with the world. Our Federal Reserve notes were like IOUs for gold, for real money. And in 1971, Nixon told the world, we're defaulting on that promise. If you own Federal Reserve notes, you can't get anything for them anymore. So that was a real default. So it's not like we haven't done that before. We've done it. But most people just assume that because we have a printing press, there's no point in the U.S. government ever defaulting. We'll just print money. Well, at some point, the world is going to realize that, yes, America is going to print a whole bunch of money. And that means the bonds I have are going to lose a lot of value because the dollars that are denominated in are going to lose a lot of value. And so now everybody wants out of the dollar, right? All these dollars, all these treasuries that are owned all around the world, and not just treasuries, but corporate bonds, any paper that's dollar denominated, people no longer want to own it. They want to get rid of it before it loses too much value. And now, of course, everybody's trying to dump dollar denominated debt at the same time. And so it collapses. And it happens very quickly, right? That old saying, how did you go broke? Well, slowly at first, then all at once. And so we have a crisis. We have a sovereign debt crisis. We have a currency crisis. It's something like, the emperor has no clothes. I don't know when this moment is going to hit because it's already overdue. You would have thought that somebody would have come to this conclusion a while ago. Now, there are some people who have, like I have, but there's not enough of me. I'm in such a small minority that the fact that I don't trust the U.S. government and I don't want to buy the bonds, that's not enough to break the market. But there's going to be a critical mass when enough people, it doesn't have to be the majority of people, but a large enough minority come to this conclusion, and that's it. The game is over.
Yeah, it's very interesting that people have not come to that conclusion yet. It feels like it's because there's so much momentum around the dollars just used everywhere, petrodollar, et cetera. So many nations own that debt. It's sort of like the whole idea that everybody talks their book. It behooves everybody that holds US dollar debt, US dollars, to not see the music stop. And so this feels like something that we would be able to see coming. This is why I'm a little surprised that people aren't more concerned about de-dollarization. It felt like what happened when we put sanctions on Russia, that was just like a starting gun to something very bad. Because if I'm a foreigner looking at that, I'm like, if they don't like my policies or something that I'm doing, then they could just freeze billions of dollars of assets. I don't like the sound of that, and I'm going to unwind it. But that unwinding process is excruciatingly slow. It is happening, but it's very, very slow, which tells me that it isn't easy, which tells me that this could be naivete, and I'm certainly willing to entertain that. But it feels like there are going to be this confluence of things adding up. And as long as you don't just keep holding your breath as it gets weirder and weirder, that you really will have a long off-ramp with which to exit. You were an early exit ramper. You took one of the first ones. It feels like more and more people are taking it, whether to Bitcoin, if you're somebody like me, or gold. I also hold gold. But there are people that are losing faith in the government, that's for sure, and then finding other ways to get out. One thing I'd like...
The exit ramp that you're talking about, it's been a very, very long one. In fact, I think it's been so long, that's part of the problem, because there's a lot of complacency that's been built up over the years, because people, including me, have been warning about these problems and the inevitable consequences for a long time. Yet, to a lot of people, hey, the Dow's at an all-time record high, everything is fine, and so there's nothing to worry about. When Ross Perot, got as many votes as he did, he ran on a campaign about, the debt is unsustainable, and it was only a couple of trillion back then. But here it is now, 35 trillion, and people think, well, you see, what's the problem? Why can't it go to 100 trillion? It got to 35 trillion. And so people just have a false sense of complacency that it's gone on for this long, so it's going to go on forever. And, it won't. Nothing that's unsustainable is going to go on forever. The fact that it's gone on as long as it has, though, has gotten people to believe that. But it just means that, we're that much closer to the collapse. And when it happens, it's going to be even worse, because we're collapsing from a much higher level, right? We have a much bigger bubble now. And so it's far more catastrophic when the air comes out than would have been the case had it happened 10 years ago, 20 years ago. And in fact, the more catastrophic it obviously is, the more pressure there is on the powers that be to delay it even more, because it's like so bad. I mean, we keep saying, well, it's our dollar, it's your problem. And to an extent, it is everybody's problem. But the longer they stay with it, the bigger that problem gets. And we certainly accelerated it by weaponizing the dollar. I mean, as if people didn't have enough economic reasons to de-dollarize, Biden gave them a big political reason to do that by weaponizing it, by threatening sanctions and to kick you off of SWIFT or to confiscate your treasuries. So pretty much we told the world, get rid of your dollars, right? I mean, that's what, which is the dumbest thing that we could have done, because that's the only reason that the whole thing isn't imploding, because the world has been dumb enough to stockpile our dollars. And we just gave them another powerful incentive not to do that. So we know it's happening. The question is, when will the pace quicken? And I think as the dollar starts to fall, and it's just started now, again, the dollar index is off about 10% from its peak, which is set a little over a year and a half ago. And again, we're close to an all-time record low against the Swiss franc. We only have to drop another maybe 7.5% to hit an all-time record low. And that's going to be the first currency, I think, that the dollar hits a record low in. But it's not going to be the last. More currencies. But I think once the dollar index really starts to break down, maybe the breaking point is 80, maybe it's 70, somewhere around there. But once the dollar starts to fall faster, and when inflation rears its head in a bigger way in the US, but the Fed doesn't do anything about it because we're in recession and the unemployment rate is up, and the world kind of, comes to this conclusion that, we can't pay, inflation is never going away, and, the last man stuck with dollars is the loser, right? Right now, the central banks around the world are slowly divesting of dollars because there's no real urgency, right? The dollar's not crashing, and so they can slowly work their way out of the problem. But as the dollar starts to fall more, it creates a bigger sense of urgency that I better get out, because the longer I sit here, the more I'm going to lose. And so that's going to accelerate the rush to get out of the dollar, which is why eventually it's just going to implode, because now so many people want to get out and there's nobody to get in to take the other side of the trade.
When that unholy hell begins to break loose in the US, what does that look like from a sector's perspective? What sectors are most vulnerable? Where are we going to start making investments? Like, for instance, are we going to then start investing in manufacturing at home? What does that moment look like as we start to build our way back out of it?
Well, remember, we have built this consumer-focused economy based on the dollar's reserve status. Better than 70% of our GDP comes from Americans just spending money. And they spend a lot of that money on imports. And so when the dollar crashes, those imports are just not coming in anymore. And so all of these stores are just going to have empty shelves. And so when there's empty shelves, they don't need their employees anymore, right? So, this whole service sector economy is going to be the hardest hit by the dollar crash, right? Because the consumption is going to come to an end. And that's the lion's share of our phony economy. It's all based on services. And that's where you're going to see the biggest hit. Now, if you're manufacturing, right? If you're manufacturing stuff that you can export, you're going to benefit from that. Your costs, some of your costs will go up. Your labor costs are going to collapse, right? Because the wages that you're paying your workers have crashed because the dollars have crashed. Your raw material costs, they could go up because you're globally, when you're a business, you're competing globally for resources, raw materials, but labor is pretty much, captive, right? So if I'm a worker and I'm in, Illinois, and, my choices for employers are there. I can't go to Japan if they have higher wages. I can't just up and move to Japan. I just got to accept, the best job that's within my reach. So wages are going to come way down in America on a global scale. And so that will help a lot of businesses become more productive, factories and so maybe companies that now are producing goods and selling in America, they'll start shipping those goods abroad and selling them to foreigners and making them here. So that will help. So those industries will do better. That's why if I was going to be investing in the US, I would want to invest in businesses that produce products or services that are in demand outside the United States, that can be sold, exported. So that part of the economy is going to do better. Unfortunately, that's a smaller part of our economy, right? So much of it is based on distribution of imports. And even a lot of, service sector jobs where they're not selling goods, where they're providing products, a lot of the stuff that they use in the provision of those services are imported. And of course, energy is just going to go way up, because even the energy that we produce ourselves, if the dollar crashes, most of the energy that we produce, we're just going to export it to other countries because those people can pay more. Right? We don't just compete with one another, we compete with the whole world. And so right now, we're at a competitive advantage with the world. We've got strong dollars and we outbid a lot of people for resources. A lot of resources we get because we could pay more, because the dollar is worth more. Well, when the dollar collapses, all of a sudden we're going to get outbid for a lot of things that we used to be able to afford. So it's going to be very disruptive to go back to reality. But, in the long run, of course, the sooner we do that, the better, because the longer it takes, the worse it's going to be, right? It's like we're in this giant hole and we just keep digging and digging and digging. Eventually, we're going to have to be, confronted and get out of this hole. So let's stop digging, right? That's the first rule of holes, right? When you're in one, you stop digging. Well, that's what we have to do. As of now, we're continuing to dig this Grand Canyon of holes, and we're making it even deeper.
Mm-hmm. How do you evaluate the companies that you invest in? You talked about, one, they're going to have to pay dividends. Two, ideally, if they're American, they're exporting something that's still going to be in demand post any sort of crash in the dollar. But what specifically are you looking for? Like if you were going to create a fund and you had to come up with a way to identify these types of companies, what are the 3 to 5 characteristics that they have beyond that they pay a dividend?
Yeah, well, firstly, I don't do all this myself. I have a whole team of portfolio managers that work for me at Europe Pacific Asset Management. I have specific portfolio managers that manage each individual fund, right? And so these guys are out there and they're doing that kind of research. But it is like a basic, a value-oriented Warren Buffett kind of stock picking style to really get familiar with the business, its balance sheet, its prospects for the future. Look at all these various, qualifications that you could look at. And, first we have computer models that screen all the universe of stocks, like for certain criterias that would evidence that we're getting a good price, right? You can relay the price of the stock to all sorts of metrics based on revenue or cash flow or earnings or book value, and try to narrow your universe to a subset of stocks that meet some type of criteria that you think would indicate that there's potential value there, but then do a deeper dive into the businesses, into the industries. I mean, I kind of have a bigger picture look at like what kind of sectors do I think will be the best to invest in. And so I kind of let my team, hey, I like this sector, whether it's metals and mining, energy, consumer, non-cyclical defensive stocks or pharmaceutical stocks. Hey, I like this sector. Find the best stocks. You guys are experts in portfolio analysis or individual stocks. So find me stocks, and I think we have a great team of stock pickers, of value-oriented stocks. People think, hey, the stock market is a great investment. It can be, it could be, but it depends on what you pay. If you overpay, it could be a very bad investment. Now, of course, people have been overpaying for stocks in the U.S. for a long time, and the prices keep going up anyway. So far, so good. But, that can come crashing down. I think it will come crashing down more so in real terms than nominal terms, because if they create enough inflation, stock prices are never going to have a meaningful decline in dollars. Where you're going to have the meaningful decline is in dollars. And so that can really destroy the value of your portfolio. So I want to invest in companies that actually represent good investment value. Just like, if you're in the real estate market, you don't want to buy real estate if the rental income isn't there. You want to try to find income producing real estate where you can buy the property and you get a good enough return on your investment in the rent. So I look at dividends on stocks. Now, some companies, if they have a lot of earnings, they have the potential to increase their dividend in the future. So I'm not only concerned about today's dividend, but what about tomorrow's dividend? Because some companies may have to cut their dividends in the future if they don't have enough income. So you don't want to just have companies that are paying dividends, but companies that are retaining enough income and investing in a growing business so they can continue to pay those dividends in the future and, in fact, increase those dividends in the future.
A very complicated game as you get deeper into it, but that all makes a lot of sense. As the local gold bug, what is your thinking on the price of gold? We're at, I think you said 2520 roughly right now, 2,520. We going up from here? Are we going down? What's your prognostication?
Yeah, I think gold is still early in an incredible bull market. The first big bull market from gold, was when it went from $35 in 1971 to $850 in 1980. Think about the size of that increase in a relatively short period of time. And especially if you look at where the price of gold was before that, when the country was established in 1789, when the Constitution was ratified, gold was $20 an ounce. It was still $20 an ounce when we formed the Federal Reserve in 1913.
Whoa.
And it was still 20. Yeah.
Wow.
And it was still $20 an ounce when we got into the Great Depression in the 1930s. But then Roosevelt, after he made it illegal for Americans to own gold, devalued the dollar. And it was $35 to buy an ounce of gold. And it was still $35 until Richard Nixon devalued the dollar in early 1970s. And so the official price of the dollar right now on the books is like $42 an ounce, right? That's the official price. But the real price is $2,500. So we had this big move from $35 to $850. Then the price of gold really came down for 20 years. In 1980, in 2000, 2001, gold was under 300. Again, it was 270, I think, in January 1st of 2001. Then we went on a big move. For 10 years, we went from 270 to 1900 in 2011. We pulled back to a low of 1,050 in 2015. We finally broke through the 2011 high really this year. I mean, we got above it briefly during COVID, and then we came right back down. But really the high was, close to 2,000. We didn't really take that out until this year, 2024. And now the Fed is about to throw gasoline on the gold fire by cutting interest rates and then going back to QE. So I think that we're about to explode higher in the price of gold, 10,000, 20,000, maybe more. You can also relate the gold price to the Dow Jones. The Dow's been around for a long time. In 1929, the peak of the Dow was 20 ounces of gold. In 1932, the Dow was 1 ounce of gold. That's taking the Dow and dividing it by the price of gold. The price of gold the Dow got back up to $20, 20 ounces of gold in the mid 1960s, and then got down to 1 ounce of gold again in the early 1980s. It got up to about 42, 43 ounces of gold in 2000 at the peak of the bubble. Right now it's about 16. I think it's about 16 to 1. And so I think the Dow is going down close to 1 to 1 again. Just say 2 to 1, just to keep it safe. So if you were going to say the Dow is going to be worth 2 ounces of gold, the Dow is 40,000. So that if the Dow stays where it is, that means gold can go to 20,000 and the Dow just stays where it is. But it's a moving target. I mean, the Dow can fall to 20,000, then gold only has to go to 10,000. The Dow can go to 50, the Dow can go to 100,000, and then gold has to go to 50,000 to be 2 to 1. But you're going to see a huge rise in the price of gold relative, I think, to stocks. But it's going to be even worse relative to bonds. I mean, because bonds are going to get obliterated, right? At least, stocks will have some value. But I think gold is very underpriced, and I think gold is going to be remonetized. I mean, gold hasn't really been the reserve. It's been the dollar. And as I said earlier, I think the dollar is going to lose its status as the reserve currency. Now, one of the reasons that a lot of people are very complacent and don't think that's going to happen is they don't think there's another currency that could take its place. They say, well, the euro, the yen, the pound, or the Chinese RMB, none of these currencies would make sense to be the reserve currency. And I agree, none of those currencies should be the reserve currency either. But what everybody overlooks is the elephant in the room, which is gold. Gold can be the reserve asset just the way it was before it was the dollar. And again, the only reason that the world accepted the dollar as the reserve initially was because it was backed by gold and redeemable on demand in gold at a fixed quantity. So even when we were on the dollar standard, we were still de facto on a gold standard. We just trusted the US government to keep its word, which turned out to be a big mistake. So I think that when the world goes off the dollar standard, it doesn't go on the euro standard or the yen standard. That makes no sense. It's going to go back to the only standard that works, and that's a gold standard. And to remonetize gold means a much higher price for gold. And so that's why I want to own my gold now before it's remonetized and everybody else owns it.
Why would that be true? Why does remonetize? What is remonetizing exactly, and why does it equal a higher price?
Well, that means that governments back their currencies with gold. So instead of having big forex reserves of dollars or pounds or euros, they have big gold reserves. right? And that's what's backing up your currency. And if you want to even go one better, you tie your currency to a fixed weight of gold. And what that does is that's going to restore confidence in the money. Because right now, money has no real value. It's just fiat, it's just paper. You can just print it, and it derives its value from the fact that we all believe it has value. Now, also, governments mandate its use, and they require the payment of taxes in it. So that's also part of why we all believe it's going to have value. But at the end of the day, it's a belief system because there's no intrinsic value in the paper at all. There was when it was backed up by gold, but now it's backed up by nothing. And so when there's a general loss of confidence in fiat currencies, which could easily happen, how do you reinstill confidence? How do you get the public to have confidence in something where they've lost confidence? Back it by gold. I mean, the way some countries now, let's say it's a South American peso, some country, and the people lose confidence, what do? They have, oh, we're going to back it by dollars. We're going to have a peg. We're going to peg the currency to the dollar to try to instill some confidence that we're just not going to print because we're going to peg it to the dollar. Well, you know, when the euro or the yen or all these currencies, when people don't confidence them, they're not going to peg it to anything. They're not going to peg it to the dollar. So they have to peg it to gold. But that could stop the presses and reinstill the confidence. Because even if the governments try to stop the presses, the velocity of money could pick up dramatically if nobody has confidence in it. It becomes like a hot potato, right? The minute you get your money, you want to spend it. You don't want to hold on to it for any length of time, even for a day, because you're so afraid of how much value it's going to lose during that day. And so then everybody wants to get rid of the money. That's really what happens with the hyperinflation. And how do you change that dynamic? Well, introduce gold and say, okay, now the currency is gold, and we have real money backing it up, and then that could create some confidence when the confidence is gone.
Peter, as always, this is incredibly enlightening. Where can people follow along with you?
Well, I'm pretty easy to find. I'm on the internet. I do a lot on social media, particularly on X. That's the platform where I tend to post a lot of my thoughts, in real time as I have them. In fact, I've done now a couple of the spaces. A lot of people have tuned into those. So, my Twitter handle is, at Peter Schiff. You'll see me there. I've got just over 1 million of followers now. And so you can join that group and follow me there. But I'm also on Instagram and Facebook, and my YouTube channel is still growing more slowly. I have about 580,000 people who subscribe to the YouTube channel. It's a good place to watch my podcasts. I do 1 or 2 of them usually per week. And so you can, they're live now. So I do the podcast live, so you can watch live as I do it, or you could just tune in on anytime on the YouTube channel and just watch it, after the fact. You can also listen to it on schiffradio.com. It's, or the podcast, the Peter Schiff Show podcast, anywhere that they have podcasts, you can download it. A lot of people are listening to it, but I think it's a great place to hear my thoughts. As far as if you want to do business with, I also have a new newsletter now. We have a free newsletter that comes out at schiffsovereign.com. You can go to that website, my last name, sovereign.com. It's almost a daily letter. It's free, a lot of good information. We have a premium letter that's, I think it's $8-9 a month, something like that, Schiff Sovereign Premium. So you can take a look at that. You get, there's a free trial. So if you don't like it, you can cancel, no questions asked. As far as becoming a client of mine, I mentioned Schiff Gold. I recommend highly that people, if you don't own any gold or silver, that you buy some. It's not an investment. It's a form of savings. It's an alternative to saving dollars or euros or yen or any other fiat currencies. You want to keep your dry powder in gold and silver. If you keep it in a fiat currency, it'll be all wet. It won't buy you very much. So everybody should have some gold and silver. You should have some physical gold and silver that you have control and possession of. And that's what we sell. And you don't need to buy rare coins, numismatic coins. If you want to be a coin collector, you can do that. But if you're just looking to have gold as a store of value, as an inflation hedge, then you just want bullion. You want bullion bars and coins, and we'll help you get the right ones there. If you have a bigger portfolio And you want to have investments, if you want to generate returns, if you want to get income on your investments, right, which you don't get from physical gold, then you want to contact my representatives at Euro Pacific Asset Management so we can go over your portfolio. And we're a registered investment advisor, and we could take your current portfolio, whether it's in a taxable account, an IRA type account, and get it into the type of investments that I believe will endure and thrive during the inflationary times that lie ahead. I think most people are completely ill-prepared. They're in the indexes in the U.S. They maybe their 60-40 portfolio. They've got a lot of overpriced U.S. tech stocks. They got a bunch of money in U.S. dollar-denominated bonds. I think these portfolios are going to get destroyed the way they did in the 1970s. People that followed the investment prescription of the 1960s that worked great in the 50s and 60s. It was the Nifty 50, it was the Xerox and the Polaroids and all these stocks. They got decimated in the 1970s. But if you had a portfolio of resource stocks, gold and silver, oil, if you invested in Japan, in emerging markets in the late 60s, or you killed it during the 1970s. So I think this is going to be the 1970s on steroids. And another thing that happened too as a result of the 1970s, that's why so many women ended up working in the 1980s and the 1990s. They didn't work in the 50s and 60s, married women, because their husbands could afford to support them. But they lost so much money due to the inflation of the 1970s that now one paycheck couldn't support a family. So now you had all these women that had to join the labor force to earn the money that their husbands lost. They lost it to inflation. They lost it to taxes. And that's been part of the degradation in our standard of living. A lot of people, when they think, oh, we haven't suffered a crisis, we have, because we've destroyed a family. We have two people that have to work, and now they don't even have one job. Now we have two people working 4 or 5 jobs, and they can't even make ends meet. Not only do you have the husband and wife both working second and third jobs, but they have no savings and they have massive credit card debt. You didn't have that. People didn't have credit card debt in the 1950s, 1960s. They had savings. So people are not, are overlooking the financial collapse that has happened. And we're just living off of extra labor and extra debt. But this whole thing is going to implode. But you definitely want to do what you can. Right? I can't stop this from happening. It's pretty much inevitable. I could just brace for the impact of the collapse, and I can protect to the best of my ability the value of my assets, right? My savings. I can get them out of harm's way. I can get them into quality stocks around the world, get good dividends. So that's what you should do. And so you contact me there at Euro Pacific Asset Management. It's europac.com is the website. There's a phone number there. You can just call us up or send us an email or something, and somebody will get back to you and start going over the way that we can help improve your portfolio and get it into the types of assets that did very well in the 1970s and that I think will do even better in the decade ahead.
I love it. Brother, thank you as always for your time. I really appreciate it. Everybody out there, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe. And until next time, my friends, be legendary. Take care. Peace.
If you like this conversation, check out this episode to learn more.
You could ask yourself, what do we celebrate? My income isn't going up as an individual. I'm not making more money, but this guy's got $200 billion. The US doesn't know pain. We have no idea. There's a world where we embrace technology, where we say we're not going to be fearful of loss, but we're going to